Hey, welcome back, Fulton County Virtual Academy students, and welcome to our next lecture on our series on U.S. history. Today what we're going to be covering is reform movements in the United States. So let's go ahead and kind of give us a little bit of background on what's going on and the different reform movements that you'll need to know, and some of the different reformers that you'll need to know to be successful on your next quiz and your next module test. Now, what we saw going on in the United States at this particular time was we saw the United States from 1800 to the 1830s experience a series of reform movements that are going to really sweep across the United States. And this was generally known as the Second Great Awakening. Much of it was due to the fact that at this particular time, many Americans were experiencing lots of change, and they were worried about some of the changes that they were seeing in the United States and some of the problems that they were experiencing. This inspired them to help to change the society for the better. And many of these reform movements get lumped together in what is called the Second Great Awakening. So there's a bunch of different reform movements and reformers that you guys need to know. The first reform movement, or one of the first ones, was to try and get people to stop drinking. And this became known as the Temperance Movement. Now, much of this was due to the fact that during this time we see a lot of immigration coming from countries that had a history of alcohol consumption, places like Germany and Ireland. And a lot of people associated poverty with these immigrants, and poverty then with also their alcohol consumption. Now, reformers tried to convince people to pledge not to drink alcohol, and many of these reformers in the temperance movement, as you can see from the image there, were by women and especially by church groups, and women church groups played a really major role in the temperance movement. Now, the temperance movement is going to be around for a long time. In fact, they've become so successful that during the 1920s, alcohol and consumption and production in the United States actually becomes illegal. It's a time period called Prohibition. But this is just the start of this particular movement. And at the time, they do actually see some success. You can actually see during the 1920s, the average annual consumption of alcohol goes way, way down. But the biggest thing that you should know about this is that this leads to the increase in size of the Protestant religious organizations in the United States. And so we start to see that in the United States, especially women and church groups, especially Protestant groups, really start to grow in size. Another major problem at this particular time was that by 1800, really, the United States didn't have a true education system for children. Although some laws such as the Northwest Ordinance, which we talked about during Module 2, had created funding for public schools in Western territories, really there wasn't public schooling in the United States, and most kids didn't go to school beyond really the first couple grades. And so this started to become an issue. And public reform really is going to start to improve our educational system. And they did a couple things. A lot of it was led by a guy named Horace Mann. And what they start to do is, first of all, we start to see compulsory school attendance. That means that you actually have to go to school. That's what we have today. You guys have to go to school. You have to have attendance. No, you guys get to stay at home, but you still got to show up and do the work. All right. In addition to this, we start to see trained teachers. Now, people actually have to go to school, get some sort of certification to actually become a teacher. Not just anybody could do this. And there was a few other changes as well, but generally speaking, these major changes, what they're going to lead to is they lead to an overall improvement in the quality of education that starts to happen in the United States. A third major problem that the United States was facing at this time was the issue of slavery. And this was obviously probably this was the biggest issue in the United States, and the ramifications we're still feeling even to this day. And as a result of the issue of slavery, one of the reform movements that we see during this time is the beginning of abolitionism. And abolitionism is the desire to emancipate or to free slaves. And we start to see it grow more and more radical and more outspoken during this particular time. We see it really especially grow in the North. And in the South, they really started to see it as a threat to their way of life. Now, there's a few abolitionists you need to know. You have to know these people. And so the first person you definitely need to know is a guy named William Lloyd Garrison. He's one of the most famous abolitionists that there are. He's a publisher of a very famous newspaper. It's called The Liberator. And he also forms an organization called the American Anti-Slavery Society to try and fight against slavery and to get slavery to end. And he really advocated and pushed for an immediate end to slavery. He did a couple really kind of famous things, like he famously burned the Constitution. He even argued for Northern secession if the U.S. government wouldn't end slavery. But he's a pretty important person, so you'll need to know him. You'll see him on your quizzes, your tests, and he's also on your vocab test as well. The other person you're going to see in all three exams is Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass is a very famous abolitionist. He was a former slave who escaped slavery in Maryland. Very famous for being able to he taught himself how to read, which was illegal for him to be able to do when he was a slave. He was the publisher of a very famous magazine called the North Star. And he also even advised President Lincoln during the Civil War. Two other major abolitionists were the Grimke Sisters. And these were both Southern women who moved to the North and became abolitionists. They saw slavery as being morally wrong, and they even were threatened with jail if they ever returned to the South. So these were two major Southern abolitionists that became pretty important during this time. Now, a fourth major problem that the United States was facing at this time was women's rights. Now, women at this time had very, very few rights in society. And one right in particular that they didn't have is they didn't have the right to vote. They had no political say in society. And so as a result of this, in 1848, two women that you need to know, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Rosita Mott, they're going to organize the first women's rights meeting, and it's called the Seneca Falls Convention. You'll notice that those are all in bold, so probably pretty important for you to know. Now, what the convention is going to produce is they're going to produce a document. It's called the Declaration of Sentiments. And it includes basically a list of demands for women's rights, including women's suffrage, which means the right to vote. So women's suffrage means the right to vote. Now, you can see there's a bunch of different people that go there, and it reads very much like the Declaration of Independence. And this movement, the women's rights movement, was very much based upon the movements of temperance and abolitionism, as well as kind of the suffragette movement. So basically it was kind of a general women's rights meeting, but really one of the big things was this kind of movement for suffrage. Now, the meeting was really important because it kind of gets the ball rolling. It starts everything off. Now, it doesn't achieve any of its major goals, but it does start kind of this entire thing going forward. All right, so today we've covered four major reform movements at this time that you guys definitely need to know. So major reform movements, all right, are the Temperance Movement, and do know that it was women in church groups, and it leads to Protestant groups becoming much more important. Do know that you've got the education reform movement, some of the education reforms, and that it leads to better kind of educated society. Definitely know abolitionism. You're gonna need to know those abolitionists. So William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and the Grimke Sisters. And we also covered the Seneca Falls Convention and the beginning of the women's rights movement. Know where it was, know the two women involved, and kind of know what women's suffrage means. It means the right to vote. Well, that's all for today. Until next time, have a great day. Bye for now.